The man puts a sensor on the soldier and peels open the soldier's left eye and sticks a needle into it. A reanimation operation is performed. Then, under the scientist's control, the soldier's memories are transmitted. Soon the difficult implantation is complete. Then the scientist called out the soldier's name and the robot responded. It turns out that the so-called resurrection was done by cloning the consciousness, but the soldier didn't accept the new body. He began to tear off his mask and destroy the machinery. The robot's body was about to go out of control, so the scientists unplugged the power supply to calm it down. So the resurrection experiment failed. The investors scolded the scientist and cut the funding for the experiment. Even his wife accused the scientist that human cloning was against social ethics. This distracted the scientist from driving, and a tree that fell on the side of the road hit him. As a result, all 5 members of the family, except him, were killed. The scientist is saddened, but he has an idea, so he calls his assistant with sensors. The assistant quickly understood the scientist's idea and took out his tools. But cloning a bionic human is difficult. The assistant tries to convince the scientists that accidents can't happen because robots have the same memory and intelligence as babies. The sad scientist didn't care about that. He just wanted to resurrect his family. But the scientist had a problem. There are only 3 cloning chambers in the lab, which means the scientist has to give up one of his family members. The scientist doesn't know what to do, so he asks his assistant to decide, but the assistant didn't want to choose either. In the end, the scientist drew lots for his youngest daughter. At that moment, he was devastated, but in order to save the rest of his family, the scientist erased all their memories of his youngest daughter. The scientist lost his family in a car accident, but the scientist wanted to clone his family, so he and his assistant started an experiment. The experiment takes 17 days, and if one chemical value is off, the clone will mutate. The scientist lies in the lab with his assistant so that the experiment can run smoothly. Over time, the clones took shape, but if the family suddenly disappeared for 10 days, others would surely notice something strange. That day, the scientist's son's teacher came to ask why the boy didn't go to school. The scientist had to lie about his son being sick in the hospital to fool the teacher. Then he opened his wife's cell phone. Many unread messages and phone calls popped up from his co-workers and family. To cover his tracks, the scientist pretended that his wife replied to all the messages. At the end of 17 days, the scientists opened the cloning chamber. As the chemical solution dwindled, a woman gradually appeared. Then the scientists took the woman out and sedated her. Now the question was how to implant the wife's consciousness into the clone. The scientist looked at the previous failed experiments and was in the end, he didn't dare to transfer her consciousness, so he gave her tranquilizers every day. Until one day, when the scientist touched his wife, he realized that her brain waves were responding. Then he tested her again, and he finally realized the previous experiment failed because the clone's body was a robot, so it would cause rejection. But now the bionic human is a real body and will not be rejected. So the scientist called his assistant to transfer his wife's consciousness to the bionic. As expected, the wife woke up right after the transfer, but the scientist injected her with a tranquilizer because he wanted to pretend that everything was normal at home. So he puts a wedding ring on her and cleans out his little girl's things. He was sad that he didn't have a clone of his little girl, but there was nothing he could do about it. The scientist does all this and lies in bed with his wife. Looking forward to the next day, in the morning, the scientist woke up and his wife was already up. He rushed out and looked at the smiling faces of his family and felt happy. They Saturday down to breakfast just as they had done before. It was as if the accident had never happened, but just when he thought he'd be living in peace, something unexpected happened. The woman was running when she suddenly felt a sharp pain in her abdomen. She thought it was something she ate, so she didn't care. At night, her eldest daughter woke up from a nightmare, screaming that her mom was dead. The father came over to reassure her that it was just a nightmare. Then after she fell asleep, he carried her to the lab and used the consciousness extractor to erase her memory of the accident. It turns out they are all bionics. A family of 4 died in a car accident. The father cloned all 3 members of his family, but his wife found out about it after decades of marriage. She knew something was wrong. The scientist knew he couldn't hide it from his wife, so he confessed about the cloning. The wife was devastated, but had no choice but to accept it. But there's the bigger problem. The owner of the tech company approached the scientist because he knew that he had cloned his family. The boss wanted the scientist to give up his human cloning technology, or he would destroy his family. The scientist had no choice but to agree, and when he handed over the information to the boss, he directly injected the boss with a tranquilizer. The boss fainted instantly. The scientist felt the danger and took his family with him to escape. On the way, they realized that they had tracking devices and could be easily detected. Luckily, the scientist's wife is a doctor. She let the scientist drive to the clinic, and she used a taser to destroy the tracker and escaped from the clinic before their pursuers arrived. They went to the pier and prepared to take a boat to escape to live on the island. When the scientist went to look for the key, the boss's men arrived and took all of the scientist's family. When the scientist arrived at the lab, he realized that his assistant had betrayed him and that he had told the boss everything. The assistant tries to explain that he was forced to do it, but the boss shot the assistant and then threatened the scientist to hand over the algorithm. The scientist had to do it to save his family. After some maneuvering, he gave the algorithm program to the boss, but the next moment, the boss tried to kill them. At that moment, a clone robot entered the room, and all the boss's men shot at the robot, but the bullets were like tickles on the titanium alloy. They were useless. It was the robot's turn to fight back, and soon all of the boss's men were gone. The scientist quickly escaped with his family, but before he left, he came back. It turns out that when he was operating the algorithm, he cloned his own consciousness into the robot, and that's what happened. Before he left, he wondered what it was like when a human's memories and consciousness were transferred to a robot. It may be strange to say, but it feels like myself. The scientist then took his family to live on the island. For him, perhaps having the same consciousness and face is enough. And that's the end of the movie.